This story is titled, My Parents Cut Me Off When I Refused to Sponsor My Sister's Engagement Party, so I immediately plotted my revenge by taking back the apartment she lived in at my expense, leaving her without a roof over her head. Now they're begging for forgiveness. Subreddit. I'm a 42-year-old woman with a family history that's complicated, to say the least. Growing up, it was always painfully obvious who my mother's favorite child was. My mom, Karen, 62F, has 2 children. Me and my younger sister, Rachel, 37F. From the moment Rachel was born, it was like I ceased to exist in my mother's eyes. I'm not trying to sound dramatic, but that's simply the truth of my childhood. Rachel was born underweight and sickly, which naturally made my mother extremely protective of her. I understand that must have been terrifying for her as a parent. However, instead of Rachel just being the baby of the family who needed extra attention, she became the only child that mattered to Karen. Rachel was this fragile little thing, and my mother treated her like an absolute princess. Everything in our household revolved around Rachel. Her needs, her wants, her moods, everything. To give you an example of how extreme the favoritism was, Rachel didn't like eating on her own, so my mother would hand-feed her until she was well into middle school. I'm not exaggerating. If Rachel had a school project or homework assignment, my mom would just complete it for her, no questions asked. If Rachel didn't feel like going to school on any given day, mom would let her stay home. No doctor's note needed, no questions asked. Meanwhile, there was me. I wasn't completely ignored. I had food, clothes, and the basic necessities a child needs to survive. But emotionally, I was entirely on my own. My mother never really took an interest in my life unless it somehow had something to do with Rachel. I remember one time when I was about 10 years old, I had a dentist appointment that my mom completely forgot about because she was busy enjoying a spa day. I ended up waiting outside my school for hours until a family friend noticed me and gave me a ride home. When I finally got back, my mother acted like it wasn't a big deal at all. She just said, "Oh, I thought you'd figure it out," as if a 10-year-old child should be responsible for figuring out their own transportation. My dad, Michael, may he rest in peace, was the only one who really saw me. He worked long hours, so he wasn't home as much as I wished he could be. But when he was around, he made a genuine effort to connect with me. Dad and I would sneak out for ice cream runs or watch movies together when Karen and Rachel were busy with their own activities. He'd slip me extra money for school trips or birthdays, always telling me not to mention it to my mom. Looking back now, I think he was trying his best to make up for how overlooked I felt in our family dynamic. But as much as my father tried, the blatant favoritism was impossible to ignore. Rachel always got the best of everything. If I wanted something, I had to work for it or save up my own money. Rachel? She'd just ask and whatever she wanted would magically appear. I remember one Christmas when I asked for a bike. I'd been hoping for one all year. Rachel, who hadn't shown any interest in bikes before, asked for the same thing at the last minute on Christmas morning. There was a shiny new bike under the tree for her, while I got a pair of socks. When I asked my mother why, she simply said, "You're older, you can save up and buy one yourself." Apparently, being the older child meant Santa automatically hated you in our household. It wasn't just material possessions, though. Karen was completely obsessed with Rachel's happiness. If Rachel had even a minor issue, like a friend not texting her back or getting a bad grade, Mom would immediately jump into action to fix it. But if I was upset about something, I was told to stop being so dramatic or to figure it out like an adult, even when I was still very much a child myself. I learned pretty quickly not to bother going to her for anything emotional or personal. Rachel, of course, soaked up all this attention. Why wouldn't she? She was living every child's dream. She didn't have to lift a finger because Mom did everything for her. It got to the point where Rachel didn't even learn basic life skills. She didn't know how to cook, clean, or even manage her own schedule because my mother shielded her from everything that might cause her the slightest discomfort. This made Rachel completely dependent on our mother, a perfect little puppet who never had to face consequences or responsibility. It wasn't until high school that I truly realized just how toxic the family dynamic had become. Rachel would constantly cry to my mother about how difficult her classes were, and Mom would respond by doing her assignments for her. When Rachel eventually failed high school, my mother didn't hold her accountable at all. Instead, she blamed the teachers, claiming they didn't understand Rachel's unique needs. She even went so far as to argue with the principal, trying to get Rachel's grades changed. It didn't work, obviously, but it clearly demonstrated just how far Karen would go to shield Rachel from any form of accountability. I, on the other hand, was expected to be completely independent from a young age. If I struggled in school, I had to figure it out on my own. If I wanted to participate in extracurricular activities, I had to pay for them myself with money I earned from babysitting jobs. And if I ever dared to complain about any of this inequality, Karen would dismissively say, "You're the older sister, you need to set an example," as if I was somehow responsible for being born first and should therefore handle everything without support. By the time I graduated high school, I couldn't wait to escape our household. I got accepted into a college in a different city, and I didn't look back when I left. Moving away was genuinely the best decision I ever made. For the first time in my life, I felt like I could breathe freely. I no longer had to constantly compare myself to Rachel or fight for scraps of attention from my mother. I could simply be myself without the shadow of favoritism hanging over me. Meanwhile, Rachel stayed living at home with our parents. She didn't move out until she got married at 26, and even then, Karen remained heavily involved in her daily life. She would call Rachel 5 times a day just to check in with questions like, "What did you eat? What are you wearing? How's your husband?" It was ridiculous how enmeshed they were. Karen would even show up unannounced at Rachel's house to clean or bring groceries, even though Rachel and her husband were perfectly capable of handling those tasks themselves. As for me, I was busy building my own life. I finished college, secured a good job, and started creating a future for myself independently. My dad stayed in touch with me, calling regularly and even visiting when he could manage it. Karen, however, barely maintained contact. She'd send the occasional text message on my birthday or leave a brief comment on my Facebook posts, but that was the extent of her interest in my life. Honestly, I didn't particularly care by that point. I was happier without her constant criticism and blatant favoritism weighing me down every day. Looking back now, I believe Karen's obsession with Rachel was fundamentally about control. She wanted Rachel to need her forever, so she deliberately never allowed her to grow up or become independent. Meanwhile, I was essentially pushed out of the nest far too early, forced to fend for myself before I was truly ready. It hurt deeply at the time, but now I see it as a blessing in disguise. I learned how to stand on my own 2 feet and build resilience, while Rachel became completely reliant on our mother for everything in her life. Even after I moved away, the family dynamic never changed. Rachel remained the golden child. Karen continued to be her enabler, and I was still the forgotten one. It's funny. Well, not funny, haha, but funny in a sad, ironic way. How some family patterns are so deeply entrenched that they never truly change. Everything in our family shifted dramatically 11 years ago. My dad started coughing frequently, and at first, it didn't seem particularly concerning. He dismissed it as allergies or perhaps a stubborn cold that wouldn't go away. But as weeks turned into months, his condition didn't improve. In fact, it steadily worsened. He was constantly tired, short of breath, and just not his usual self. Despite this, he kept working because that's the kind of dedicated, selfless man he was, always putting others first, even at the expense of his own health. Karen, my mother, barely seemed to notice that anything was wrong with him. She was too preoccupied with her usual routine of spa appointments, yoga classes, and whatever else filled her self-centered days. Rachel was back living at home by then, after her first marriage had fallen apart. She wasn't working or contributing to the household in any meaningful way, and she didn't seem particularly concerned about Dad's deteriorating health either. It was as if they both didn't want to deal with the inconvenience of acknowledging that something serious might be wrong with him. I was living in a different city at the time, focusing on building my career and maintaining some healthy distance from all the family drama back home. Dad and I talked regularly on the phone, and I could tell something was seriously off during our calls. He sounded progressively weaker and more tired with each conversation. Whenever I asked if he'd seen a doctor about his symptoms, he would brush off my concerns, insisting he was fine. But deep down, I knew he wasn't. Things finally came to a head when Dad had a particularly severe coughing fit that forced him to go to the hospital. The diagnosis was devastating: a severe lung infection that had progressed dangerously due to lack of treatment. I dropped everything and rushed home as soon as I found out. When I arrived, what I discovered horrified me. My father was lying in bed, looking so frail and sick, and yet he was completely alone. Karen and Rachel? They were out getting their nails done together, as if nothing serious was happening in our family. When they finally returned home, Karen acted surprised to see me there. She even tried to hug me as if everything was normal, but I wasn't having any of it. I immediately asked her why she wasn't with Dad when he was so clearly ill, and she gave me some flimsy excuse about needing to run errands. It was painfully obvious they'd just come from the spa. They were both freshly manicured and carrying shopping bags. Their priorities couldn't have been clearer. The hospital admitted Dad shortly after, and I stayed by his side as much as humanly possible. Karen would drop by occasionally, but only for a few minutes at a time before finding a reason to leave. Rachel? She barely showed up at all, claiming it was too hard for her emotionally to see him in such a vulnerable state. Meanwhile, I was juggling everything, talking to doctors, managing his medication schedule, and trying my best to keep him comfortable. I even slept in a chair by his bed most nights, not wanting him to be alone. Karen's lack of involvement in Dad's care was absolutely infuriating. She didn't work, so it's not like she had pressing professional obligations keeping her away. Yet she acted like visiting the hospital was some massive inconvenience that she couldn't possibly fit into her schedule. I'll never forget the day she had the audacity to say, "He's in good hands with the nurses. What am I supposed to do? Just sit there?" Yes, Karen, that's exactly what you're supposed to do. Be there for your husband of over 30 years who is seriously ill and needs support. After a week in the hospital, Dad was discharged, but he still needed constant care at home. We hired a professional nurse to help, and Karen was supposed to step up and take on more responsibility as his wife. But she proved to be as unreliable as ever. She would forget to give him his medications on time, or she'd leave for hours to run errands and return with shopping bags instead of the medical supplies he needed. One particularly egregious incident occurred when she was supposed to pick up an oxygen tank that Dad urgently needed. She decided that stopping at the salon was more important, and by the time she finally got home, I had already been forced to arrange for someone else to deliver the vital equipment. Rachel was no better than Karen in this situation. She claimed she couldn't emotionally handle seeing Dad in such a vulnerable state, so she simply avoided him. She stayed in her room most of the time, mindlessly scrolling through her phone or watching TV while her father struggled just down the hall. At one point, during one of Dad's worst episodes, Rachel even went on vacation with her friends, leaving me to handle everything on my own. The situation became so untenable that I ultimately quit my job to care for Dad full-time. I simply didn't trust Karen or Rachel to do it properly, and honestly, I didn't want to leave him alone with them. He deserved so much better than their neglect. I cooked his meals, helped him with his physical therapy exercises, and made sure he always had company so he wouldn't feel lonely or abandoned. It was physically and emotionally exhausting, but I loved him deeply and would do it all over again in a heartbeat if necessary. Karen did make some effort to be more involved as Dad's condition continued to worsen, but by then, it felt too little, too late. She would sit by his side, but she'd be completely absorbed in her phone the entire time, posting on social media or texting with Rachel instead of actually being present with her dying husband. It was as if she couldn't even give him her full attention during the final months of his life. And Rachel? She only showed up when Karen guilt-tripped her into it, and even then, she'd manufacture excuses to leave after just a few minutes. Dad passed away several months after his initial hospitalization. He was surrounded by me, his nurse, and a couple of his closest friends who had come to say their goodbyes. Karen and Rachel weren't there when he took his last breath. Karen had gone to some wellness retreat she claimed she couldn't reschedule, and Rachel was out with friends. I had called them both when it became clear that Dad didn't have much time left, but neither of them managed to show up before he passed. The funeral was a complete blur to me. I was utterly heartbroken and exhausted from months of caregiving, but I still had to deal with Karen and Rachel's inappropriate behavior even during the service. Karen spent most of the funeral service chatting with her friends about how unexpected Dad's death was, as if she hadn't been ignoring all the warning signs and his deteriorating condition for months. Rachel cried loudly throughout the service, making a dramatic spectacle of her grief, but it felt so incredibly fake and performative. She hadn't shown any genuine care or concern when it actually mattered, when Dad was alive and needed his family's support. A few weeks after the funeral, I received a call from Dad's lawyer about his will. I wasn't expecting much, perhaps a small inheritance or a sentimental keepsake. But when I met with the lawyer, I was completely stunned by what I learned. Dad had left everything to me, the house, his savings, his entire estate. Karen and Rachel received nothing at all. It broke my heart to think about how much pain Dad must have felt in his final months, knowing how little his wife and younger daughter truly cared about him. Leaving everything to me was his way of acknowledging that he saw me and appreciated everything I had done for him when he needed it most. But as you might expect, his decision sparked an absolute firestorm within the family. Karen and Rachel were livid when they found out about the will. Rachel actually screamed at the lawyer, insisting it was impossible that Dad would do this to her. Karen immediately called me, demanding that I share the inheritance with them despite their complete absence during Dad's illness. I firmly refused. Their behavior had made it abundantly clear that they didn't deserve a share in Dad's estate. After that confrontation, I made the difficult but necessary decision to cut off all contact with Karen and Rachel. It was essential for my mental health and emotional well-being. They were furious about the will, and their sense of entitlement was utterly exhausting to deal with. I moved back to the city where I had been working before Dad's illness, focused on rebuilding my life, and eventually met the wonderful man who would become my husband. We got married, had a beautiful baby, and eventually moved overseas for my husband's job. It was a fresh start for us as a family, and honestly, I didn't feel any need to inform Karen or Rachel about these major life events. They had shown no interest in being genuinely involved in my life, so why would I include them now? Fast forward a few years to when I gave birth to my daughter. Out of nowhere, Karen suddenly showed up at my house. I hadn't spoken to her in years, so seeing her standing on my doorstep was an absolute shock. She looked different, less polished, more tired and worn down by life. She apologized profusely, cried, and said she wanted to be part of my daughter's life. She even admitted that she regretted how she had treated me growing up and claimed she'd been living with guilt ever since Dad passed away. She insisted that she just wanted to make amends and have a relationship with her granddaughter. I'll be completely honest. I didn't trust her motives for a second, but I decided to give her one last chance, thinking perhaps becoming a grandmother had genuinely changed her perspective. For a while, things seemed relatively normal. Karen would video call to check on my daughter and occasionally send thoughtful gifts. It almost felt like we were developing a healthy relationship for the first time in our lives. But then, as I should have expected, the hints about money started creeping into our conversations. Karen would casually mention how she was struggling financially or how difficult life had been for her since I took everything in the inheritance. I chose to ignore these comments, hoping they would eventually stop. About a month ago, Karen called me. She sounded uncharacteristically excited, which immediately put me on edge because Karen doesn't typically call unless she wants something specific. She started the conversation with awkward small talk, asking about my daughter and my husband, which felt strange and forced coming from her. Then she dropped the real reason for her call. Rachel was getting married again. Now, if you remember from what I shared earlier, Rachel's first marriage had ended after about a year, and she had moved back in with Karen afterward. She never really got her life back on track or developed any independence. I hadn't spoken to Rachel in over a decade, so this news about her engagement came completely out of nowhere. Karen went on and on about how much this wedding meant to Rachel, how it represented a fresh start for her, and how happy it would supposedly make the entire family. I was polite and offered my congratulations, assuming that would be the end of the conversation. But of course, with Karen, nothing is ever that simple. Karen then said something along the lines of, it's been really hard for Rachel to plan this wedding with her limited budget. She deserves a beautiful day after everything she's been through. I stayed quiet on the phone because I already knew exactly where this conversation was heading. Finally, she just came out with it. I was hoping you could help out with the wedding expenses. It's the least you can do considering everything your father left you. I was absolutely furious. First of all, Rachel and I don't even speak to each other. We haven't had any kind of relationship for over a decade. Second, how entitled do you have to be to ask someone to pay for a wedding they're not even invited to? Because yes, Karen made it perfectly clear during our conversation that I wasn't actually on the guest list for this event that she expected me to finance. When I pointed out this glaring inconsistency, Karen tried to backpedal awkwardly, saying, "Oh, we just assumed you wouldn't want to travel with a baby, but of course you're welcome to come. You don't need an actual invitation. It's your sister's wedding after all." The transparent manipulation was insulting. I told her flatly, no, I wasn't paying for anything related to Rachel's wedding. She immediately tried to guilt me, claiming it was my responsibility as the elder sister to help Rachel. She even had the audacity to bring up Dad's inheritance again, accusing me of hoarding the family fortune, while Rachel supposedly struggled financially. I reminded Karen that Rachel and I had absolutely no relationship whatsoever, and if she wanted financial help, she could reach out to me directly rather than sending our mother as an intermediary. Predictably, Rachel never did contact me herself. She was perfectly content to let Karen fight this battle for her, just as she had her entire life. Karen didn't accept my refusal. Over the next few weeks, she bombarded me with texts and voicemails, all variations of the same manipulative argument. I was selfish, I didn't care about family, and I was deliberately letting Rachel down. She even said, "If you don't help, it'll ruin Rachel's big day, and everyone will know it's your fault." As if I should care about the opinions of extended family members who had stood by silently watching the favoritism for decades. The thing that infuriated me most was that Karen and Rachel were acting like I somehow owed them something. But where were they when I needed support? When Dad was sick and dying, I was the one who dropped everything in my life to care for him. I was the one who stayed by his side while they went on with their lives as if nothing was wrong. And now, after years of complete silence, they expected me to magically appear and solve their financial problems. Absolutely not. Karen escalated things by claiming that Rachel had already booked the venue and paid deposits for the decorations, caterers, and musicians. She insisted that canceling everything now would humiliate the entire family because the invitations had already been sent out. When I asked her the obvious question, how they had planned all this if they couldn't actually afford it, her response was stunning in its entitlement. "We were counting on you." That was the final straw for me. I told Karen in no uncertain terms that she could figure it out herself because I wasn't giving them a single penny of my money. She immediately started crying, saying that if I didn't help, she would have no choice but to cut me out of her life entirely. I actually laughed at this threat and said, "You already treated me like I didn't exist for most of my life, so what's the difference now?" Then I hung up the phone and blocked her number. My husband completely supported my decision, though he did warn me that there might be some backlash from extended family members. He was right about that. A few relatives reached out to me saying I should be the bigger person and help out because family is family. But where was all this concern for family unity when Karen and Rachel were treating me like I was nothing for decades? I ignored their messages and stood my ground firmly. Karen's final message to me was a voicemail that somehow made it through despite being blocked. She said, "If you can live with ruining your sister's wedding, then I guess you're not the person I thought you were." I haven't responded to this emotional blackmail. And honestly, I don't plan to. I've spent far too much of my life bending over backward for people who don't appreciate it or reciprocate in any way. I'm done with that pattern. After all the wedding drama, I was completely finished with Karen and Rachel. They had pushed me beyond my limits with their entitlement and manipulation. I should mention that I'd been letting them live rent-free in the house my dad left me for over 10 years. I guess part of me thought it was the easier option at the time. I didn't want to deal with the drama of evicting them, especially right after my dad passed away when emotions were already running high. But over the years, I came to realize they had absolutely no gratitude, no respect for me, and no intention of ever treating me decently. They took my generosity for granted and still had the audacity to demand more. Let me rewind a bit to provide some context about the house situation. When Dad's will was read and the lawyer informed everyone that he had left everything to me, Karen and Rachel were absolutely livid. Karen argued vehemently that it was her house because she had lived there for decades, completely ignoring the fact that it was Dad's name on the deed all along. Rachel threw a full-blown tantrum, screaming about how unfair it was that she got nothing from the estate. But the truth is, neither of them deserved a penny from Dad's estate. He left me the house because he had witnessed firsthand how much I cared for him during his final months while they couldn't even be bothered to show up most of the time. It was his way of saying, "I see you and I appreciate you." It was the recognition I had never received from my mother. Even after inheriting everything, I made the decision to let them continue living in the house. I thought that maybe, just maybe, this arrangement would inspire them to change their behavior and show some gratitude. But Karen continued to act as though the house still belonged to her. She even started renting out one of the spare bedrooms to generate income for her personal expenses, never once offering to pay me any rent for the property that was legally mine. Rachel treated me like I was some kind of villain who had stolen her birthright. She spread vicious rumors among our extended family members, claiming that I had somehow manipulated Dad into cutting her out of the will during his illness. They made absolutely no effort to repair our fractured relationship, but they certainly enjoyed living rent-free in a house they had no legal claim to. Fast forward to the present situation, after Karen's ridiculous request that I pay for Rachel's wedding and all the manipulation attempts that followed. I finally decided that enough was enough. I contacted my lawyer and had a formal eviction notice drafted and delivered to them. When Karen received the eviction notice, she completely lost her mind. She called me screaming, "You can't evict me! This is my home! I've lived here for 45 years!" I calmly reminded her that the house was legally mine and that she had 30 days to vacate the premises according to local housing laws. Rachel, predictably, jumped into the fray to defend her mother. She called me every vile name imaginable, accusing me of being heartless and greedy. According to her warped perspective, I had only cared for Dad during his illness to secure the inheritance for myself. The accusation was laughable coming from her. She was the one who had barely visited Dad when he was dying, who couldn't be bothered to sit with him for more than a few minutes at a time. Yet somehow, in her mind, I was the villain of this story. Karen tried every manipulation tactic in her arsenal to make me change my mind about the eviction. First, she tried to intimidate me, saying, "I dare you to kick me out. I'm not going anywhere." When that didn't work, she switched to playing the victim, claiming she was too old to start over, and that the house was all she had left in the world. She even cried about how she'd been renting out a room to make ends meet, the same room that I should have been collecting rent on for years as the legal owner of the property. None of her tactics worked on me this time. The final straw came when she tried to guilt-trip me by saying, "What would your dad think if he saw you throwing your mother out on the street?" That crossed a line. I told her directly that Dad had left me the house for a reason. "Maybe if you'd cared about him even half as much as you cared about your spa appointments, he'd still be alive," I said. I know that was harsh, but I was done sugarcoating things after years of their manipulation. Karen had made her choices throughout her life, and now she had to face the consequences of those choices. Rachel didn't take the eviction notice well either. She told Karen she could move in with her temporarily, but not without making a dramatic production out of the situation. She called every relative in our extended family to brag about how she was stepping up for Karen, claiming she didn't need anything from me. The whole performance was so transparently self-serving. She wanted everyone to applaud her for doing the bare minimum while painting me as the cruel daughter who had cast her poor mother out. Karen moved out of the house on the 26th day of the 30-day notice period. I didn't even bother to show up for the move-out. I hired a property manager to handle the handover of keys and final inspection. Once the house was empty, I had it professionally cleaned and renovated to erase the years of neglect under Karen's care. I decided to lease the property to a family friend's brother, someone I trusted to take care of the place. It felt good knowing the house would finally be occupied by people who would actually appreciate it. Meanwhile, Rachel's grandiose wedding plans fell apart when I refused to finance them. She had to downgrade from the fancy lakeside venue she'd been dreaming of to a simple ceremony at the local town hall. Apparently, this caused significant embarrassment for her among their social circle, and Rachel's fiancé wasn't particularly happy about the situation either. It turned out he hadn't even wanted an elaborate wedding in the first place. Rachel had promised him she'd find a way to pay for everything, which was clearly code for "my sister will pay for it all" in her mind. Not long after Karen moved in with Rachel, I started hearing whispers from mutual acquaintances about trouble brewing in paradise. Rachel's husband wasn't exactly thrilled about having his mother-in-law as a permanent house guest. Karen, true to her nature, couldn't help but meddle in their daily lives. She'd criticize Rachel's cooking, comment on how Rachel's husband ran the household, and generally make herself an insufferable nuisance to live with. A few of our more distant relatives have tried to guilt-trip me into forgiving Karen and Rachel. They keep insisting that I've gone too far by evicting Karen from the house, and that I should have let her stay there out of respect for family. But honestly, I don't care about their opinions anymore. These same people remained completely silent when I was being mistreated throughout my childhood and adult life, so their judgments mean absolutely nothing to me now. All right, everyone. Before I dive into the final update on this situation, I have a small request. We put a lot of effort into maintaining healthy boundaries and standing up for ourselves against toxic family members every single day. And your support means the world to those of us who share our stories. If you found value in my experience, please consider offering encouragement to others going through similar situations. It really helps us all grow and allows us to continue healing from family trauma. Thank you for listening to my story so far, and now let's move on to the conclusion. Here's the final update on this family saga. After Karen moved in with Rachel, I thought I'd finally have peace in my life. I had the house successfully leased out, I was focusing on my own family, and I had cut off most of the toxic relatives who tried to guilt me into forgiving Karen and Rachel despite their appalling behavior. For a while, I didn't hear anything about them, and honestly, I was relieved. But of course, that period of calm didn't last long. About 2 months after the eviction, a mutual relative contacted me asking if I'd heard about the latest drama involving Karen and Rachel. I hadn't, and to be completely honest, I wasn't sure I even cared anymore. But curiosity got the better of me, so I asked what had happened. The story they told me was equal parts infuriating, and I have to admit, somewhat satisfying to hear. Apparently, Rachel's husband Chris had finally had enough of Karen's constant meddling in their household and gave Rachel an ultimatum. Either she goes or I go. Rachel was already on thin ice with him because of the entire wedding debacle. Remember how she had promised him a grand wedding celebration that I would supposedly fund? When that didn't materialize as she had planned, they had to settle for a small town hall ceremony instead, which deeply embarrassed Rachel in front of her friends and his family members. Chris had actually warned her not to overextend themselves financially with wedding plans, but she hadn't listened to his practical advice. This had already created significant tension in their relationship, and with Karen now living in their home, the situation had only deteriorated further. Karen would criticize Chris's cooking whenever he prepared meals, question his parenting style with their toddler, and even comment on the way he spoke to Rachel. She would constantly offer unsolicited suggestions about how they should manage their household finances, which was particularly ironic considering her own financial mismanagement had left her dependent on others for housing. Chris tried to tolerate the situation for a while for Rachel's sake, but after one particularly nasty argument where Karen accused him of not being man enough to properly care for his family, he reached his breaking point. He told Rachel it was time to choose between her mother and her marriage. Rachel begged him to reconsider, but he remained firm in his position. The most interesting part of the story, though, was that Karen didn't accept this turn of events gracefully. When Rachel reluctantly informed her about Chris's ultimatum, Karen completely lost her composure. She accused Rachel of abandoning her just like everyone else, and even threatened to cut Rachel out of her will. An empty threat considering Karen had essentially nothing to leave behind at this point. This led to a massive argument between them, and Rachel, frustrated and likely embarrassed by the whole situation, finally told Karen she needed to figure things out for herself. So where did Karen go after being asked to leave Rachel's house? To absolutely no one's surprise, she tried to reach out to me again. She sent me an email, since I had blocked her on all other communication platforms, asking if I would reconsider letting her move back into the house that had been left to me by Dad. Her email was a masterclass in manipulation. She wrote about how life had been so cruel to her, and how she had always done her best as a mother. She even tried to frame her request as an opportunity for us to heal and rebuild our relationship after all these years. I didn't even bother responding to her transparent attempt at emotional manipulation. At this point, her tactics were just sad and predictable. After getting no response from me, Karen tried to guilt-trip several extended family members into taking her in. Most of them refused outright, probably because they've witnessed her manipulative behavior over the years and wanted no part of it. One distant cousin eventually agreed to let Karen stay temporarily, but her hospitality lasted all of 3 weeks before Karen was asked to leave. The cousin apparently grew tired of Karen's demanding behavior and constant complaints about everything in the household. As for Rachel, she's now dealing with the consequences of her lifelong pattern of poor decisions. Her husband Chris didn't follow through on his threat to leave her, but their relationship is reportedly on extremely shaky ground. Between the wedding expenses they couldn't afford, the drama with Karen moving in and then being asked to leave, and Rachel's persistent refusal to take responsibility for anything in her life, Chris has started emotionally and financially distancing himself from her. He even suggested they attend couples counseling to work through their issues, but Rachel has been telling everyone who will listen that he's the problem in their marriage, not her. I've also heard through our family grapevine that Rachel has been venting to relatives about how unfair it is that I received everything from Dad's estate. According to her skewed version of events, if I had just shared the inheritance equally with her, none of these problems would have happened. She conveniently omits the part where she and Karen essentially abandoned Dad during his final months of life and treated me like a villain for being the only one who actually cared for him. In their world, it's always someone else's fault. They never take responsibility for the consequences of their own actions. Despite all the ongoing drama on their end, I've been doing remarkably well with my own life. Leasing out the house was the best decision I could have made. The tenants are a wonderful family who genuinely love and respect the property in a way Karen never did. The rental income has provided me with additional financial security and allowed me to invest in my daughter's future education. My husband and I are thriving in our careers, and we've recently started planning a long overdue family vacation that we've been dreaming about for years. As for Karen and Rachel, they've made their choices throughout their lives, and now they're living with the consequences of those decisions. Karen is still reportedly bouncing between the homes of increasingly reluctant relatives, wearing out her welcome wherever she goes. Rachel is stuck in a marriage that appears to be circling the drain due to her inability to grow up and take responsibility for herself. I don't actively wish them ill. I simply don't care about their problems anymore. Their drama is no longer my concern, and that realization has been the most liberating feeling of all. Looking back at this entire saga, I can see how the patterns established in my childhood continue to play out well into adulthood. Karen always favored Rachel, enabling her dependence and lack of personal responsibility. I was always expected to be the adult in the family, even as a child, taking care of everyone else while receiving nothing in return. Dad was the only one who truly saw me and valued my contributions, which is why he made the decision he did with his will. The difference now is that I've broken free from those toxic patterns. I no longer feel obligated to rescue Karen and Rachel from the consequences of their own choices. I don't feel guilty for enforcing boundaries and protecting myself and my own family from their manipulation and entitlement. I've built a life based on mutual respect, love, and responsibility, all the things that were missing from my childhood home. Sometimes people ask me if I miss having a mother and sister in my life, and the honest answer is no. I miss the mother and sister I should have had, but I don't miss the ones I actually got. The peace that has come from removing them from my life has been worth any momentary pangs of family sentiment. My husband and daughter are my family now, the family I chose and built with love, rather than the one I was born into. Thank you to everyone who has read this long saga. If you're dealing with toxic family members of your own, please know that it's okay to set boundaries. It's okay to walk away, and it's okay to prioritize your own well-being. You don't owe anyone your mental health or emotional stability, no matter how closely related you might be. Take care of yourselves, and thank you for everything.